King's Neglected Dream, Salvation for the Oppressor. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is world-renowned for his pursuit of justice, freedom, and equality for African Americans across the United States. However, what people often neglect is the second half to King's dream, to free the hatred from white people's hearts in order to save them and truly reach justice for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of our children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is one of the most famous of the civil rights movement. At the end of the speech, King lays out a vision of the world in which black people and white people join hands and, quote, sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. In those famous words, King envisions not only the freedom of black people from oppression, but also the freedom of white people from their own fear and hatred. We want to focus on the latter and less familiar statement.
Both the means and the ends of King's movement involved justice and love. The means were nonviolent resistance, through loving your enemies. His end goal was the beloved community, in which black and white people lived together in harmony. This means that black people must be freed from oppression, but also that white people must be freed from fear and hate. King used both religious and non-religious arguments to make this point.
As a pastor, King emphasized the religious reasons behind his goal to free white people from hate and fear. He stressed that protesters must follow the example and commands of Jesus to love one's enemies. In his book, Stride Towards Freedom, King instructs, quote, once again, we must hear the words of Jesus echoing across the centuries. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and pray for those that despitefully use you.
King also strongly endorsed freeing hatred from white people's hearts in order to save their souls and help them fulfill God's ultimate goal of redemption. He goes so far as to argue that the souls of white men need the love of the people they've oppressed, writing, quote, since the white man's personality is greatly distorted by segregation and his soul is greatly sacred, he needs the love of the Negro. The Negro must love the white man because the white man needs his love to remove his tensions, insecurities, and fears. King believes that social justice workers can help free their oppressors from hate by helping them recognize the immorality of their actions. He wants to, quote, awaken a sense of moral shame in the opponent. He says, quote, we must meet forces of hate with the power of love. We must meet physical force with soul force. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding.
Juxtaposing his religious reasons why hate is so harmful to the oppressor, King also emphasizes non-religious arguments to demonstrate that hatred can have tremendously negative effects on the oppressor as well as the oppressed. King writes, quote, hate damages the white man in many instances more than it damages the Negro, for it does something to the personality. It does something to the soul. And this is why I say that our struggle in the United States today is not merely a struggle to free the Negro, but is also a struggle to free our white brothers from their fears, from their prejudices, from their hate, and all of those attitudes that destroy and damage the soul. In Loving Your Enemies, King points out the psychological damage associated with hate. He tells the story of a woman who burned her couch after a mixed-race woman sat on it, a clear example of damaging pathological hate. King also addresses the harm hatred can cause through the discussion of evil. He says, quote, the attack is directed against forces of evil rather than against persons who are caught in those forces. It is evil we are seeking to defeat, not persons victimized by evil.
Gandhi's demonstrations of nonviolence and insights about love greatly influenced King's belief that hate can be extremely detrimental to the oppressor. Gandhi's beliefs add reason and meaning to many of King's words. In his essay, Nonviolence and Racial Justice, King interprets one of Gandhi's definitions for love, agape. Quote, Agape means understanding, redeeming goodwill for all men, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. It begins by loving others for their sakes. Here we rise to the position of loving the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed he does. With help from Gandhi's words and beliefs, King concludes that this often neglected and misunderstood idea about social justice, quote, "So the nonviolent approach does not immediately change the heart of the oppressor. It first does something to the hearts and souls of those committed to it. It gives them new self-respect. It calls upon resources of strength and courage that it did not know they had. Finally, it reaches the opponent and so stirs his conscience that reconciliation becomes a reality."
Reinhold Niebuhr, one of King's influences, argued that love was sometimes not enough to reach the hearts of oppressors. In arguing that the Christian church cannot be pacifist, he points out the naivete of pacifists who, quote, assert that if only men loved one another, all the complex and sometimes horrible realities of political order could be dispensed with. King offers a clear response to this by explaining his goals of nonviolent resistance. He writes, quote, "True pacifism is not unrealistic submission to evil power, as Niebuhr contends. It is rather a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love in the faith that it is better to be the recipient of violence than to be the inflictor of it, since the latter only multiplies the existence of violence and bitterness in the universe, while the former may develop a sense of shame in the opponent and thereby bring about a transformation and change of heart."
Malcolm X also argues against King's idea that white people should be saved or freed from hatred. In his message to the grassroots, X argues that black people should stand together against a common enemy, white people, saying that the white man is, quote, an enemy to all of us. King might respond by pointing out that while he must love white people, he does not love the unjust system that led to black people's oppression. In Loving Your Enemies, he writes, quote, "There must be an active love for the individuals who may be caught up in an evil, unjust system, while we continue to work passionately and unrelentingly to do away with the system itself." Malcolm X turned more toward the language of love and brotherhood later in his life. After his trips to Africa and the Middle East, Malcolm X writes, quote, "I no longer subscribe to sweeping indictments of one race," and he believes that black and white people should, quote, "accept each other as brothers and sisters regardless of complexion."
Our goal was to shed the light on the second half of King's dream, to free the hatred from white people's hearts in order to save them and truly reach justice for all. If more people recognize this goal, it could give us a more complete understanding of King's philosophy, and even further, it could make social justice movements more hopeful and inclusive.